The Ukraine-Russia war has turned into a prestige struggle for Moscow because of Vladimir Putin's secret Game of Thrones behind the scenes. Putin's tragedy, which was staged in the cold rooms of the Kremlin, has now confined Russia generally to feelings of fear and purification. For this reason, most of the Russian citizens who oppose the Ukraine war are paying the price for Putin's sins. While Russia is currently in financial trouble because of the war, Vladimir Putin's persistent insistence on attacking Ukraine has made the country much worse than Russia during the Stalin era. The radical and risky decisions of the Russian leader also eroded the Moscow army. Putin had almost the second strongest army in the world before the war started. But now all that remains of the Russian army is a group of soldiers whose order has been turned upside down by the mobilization decision. The striking failures of Russia on the Ukrainian fronts in the last period also deeply affected the morale of the soldiers in the Moscow army. Currently, most of the Russian soldiers do not believe in any way that a victory will come out of the Ukrainian war. On the contrary, Putin's army wants this war to end as soon as possible and their old life to continue. The current situation of the Russian soldiers mobilized into the Moscow army is deplorable. These soldiers complain about not being able to eat regularly, sleeping on wet floors, and still being tortured and beaten by their commanders. While the tragic hidden side of the war reveals the structure of the Moscow army, the fact that even the Ukrainian armed forces did not remain silent on this situation shows how sublime and compassionate Zelensky's army is. The Ukrainian armed forces had launched an extraordinary project for the soldiers who were forced to fight in the Moscow army, and for the anti-war citizens in Russia. The Ukrainian armed forces, which gave a new ray of hope to the Russians with a surrender line called "I Want to Live," laid the foundations of the attempt to save the lives of more than 1 million people. The Ukrainian armed forces, which guarantees that it will secure the lives of Russians who want to surrender within the provisions of the Geneva Convention, has also created a great source of inspiration for hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens who do not want to take part in the Moscow army and who respect Ukraine's freedom struggle. In all this goodwill of Ukraine, an international legion group was established within the Kiev army. Thousands of anti-Putin Russian and Belarusian citizens were included in this legion group, which supported the Ukrainian soldiers even on the hottest front lines since the first months of the war. It is known that this legion group, which does not share in any way how many people they are due to security measures, has reached very serious numbers. It is estimated that at least 50,000 foreign volunteers are currently fighting against the Russians from the Ukrainian fronts. Among these 50,000 brave soldiers are volunteers from more than 50 countries, including Belarus and Russia. As the number of Russians decided to switch sides and fight for the Kiev army, Moscow officials began to look for a way to stop this situation. With the course of the war changing considerably, the Russians now see that Putin puts his personal interests above the survival of his country in the struggle for reputation. That's why now thousands of Russians have changed their minds and started fighting for the Ukrainian army. Moscow's efforts to prevent this situation are quite terrible and cruel. The Moscow administration imposed very strict criminal sanctions against those who decided to change their ranks and fight for the Ukrainian army in Russia. But these decisions did not change anything for Russian citizens who realized the truth and wanted to contribute to Ukraine's freedom struggle in this war. The most shocking and interesting example of this situation took place recently. A Russian citizen whom the Federal Security Service alleges plans to fight for Ukraine was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months in prison yesterday. Sergei Ulukshanov, 30, from the Siberian city of Krasnoyarsk, was convicted by the district court, pro-Kremlin news outlet Kommersant reported. Ulukshanov was accused of planning to join Ukraine's armed forces and fight against Russia in the conflict that began when President Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. Ulukshanov was found guilty by Russian courts of preparing to join an armed order on the territory of a foreign state. In court documents, it is claimed that Sergei Ulukshanov shared Nazi views and committed treason. Also, the 30-year-old player was accused in the spring of 2022 of pursuing pro-Ukrainian websites and communicating with the Ukrainian side. According to court records on April 3rd, Ulukshanov was in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, on the border with Ukraine. Allegedly, he called a representative of the Security Service of Ukraine, who explained how to illegally cross the border between Ukraine and Belarus. Ulukshanov was later detained by Belarusian border guards, and the authorities handed him over to the FSB. Court documents describe him as an ardent opponent of the domestic and foreign policy of the Russian Federation. Moreover, Russian courts with all this information accepted Aluksanov as guilty. Another example of the Russian administration's brutal policies emerged a few days ago, with the detention of a Russian man accused by the FSB of trying to leave Russia and join the Ukrainian armed forces at Krasnoyarsk airport. FSB spokesman informed Russia's state news agency Interfax and RIA Novosti that the man residing in Abakan in the Russian Federation's Republic of Khakassia was charged with attempted treason. The Moscow security agency stated that this Russian citizen, who was arrested, wanted to join the Ukrainian armed forces in support of actions described as hostility. The FSB announced that this Russian citizen had previously committed acts of vandalism against administrative buildings in Khakassia and was tried in a vandalism case. There are thousands of similar events in Russia. Russian citizens no longer want the Moscow administration's understanding of the regime and justify the desire of the Ukrainians to return to their former independent days. Moreover, after Putin signed a law that equates asylum with treason and carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison, there has been a record increase in the number of opponents of war and mobilization decisions in Russia. The Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who took very harsh sanction decisions due to the Ukraine war, prevents his citizens from making free decisions, causing the number of Russian citizens joining the Ukrainian army to increase day by day. These strategies of Vladimir Putin not only cause Russian citizens to change their minds and join Ukraine, but also shake the trust of people in the Russian parliament and Moscow administration in Putin. Currently, one of the most talked about topics in the Kremlin is the war policies of the Russian leader. The Kremlin is tired of covering up Putin's mistakes and presenting him as a leader who still looks out for Russia's interests. Therefore, all these factors put the future administration life of the Russian leader in great danger. The achievements of the Ukrainian army, on the other hand, both draw the attention of anti-war citizens in Russia and force leader Vladimir Putin into a corner and make mistakes. But the Russian leader's backing is considered a very serious risk factor according to certain groups. The reason for this is seen as Vladimir Putin's desire to embrace nuclear weapons as a last resort, which is all-consuming and has not many ways out. Putin increased this nuclear threat even more when the Kiev army recaptured many Ukrainian cities occupied by Moscow soldiers. The USA and Western European countries, on the other hand, started to impose economic sanctions on Russia with the same weight, day by day. Against the threats and blackmails of the Russian leader, especially the U.S. administration has taken striking economic sanction decisions against Russia in recent days. As a result of these decisions, the Moscow government used the citizens of its own country and the soldiers of its army as a pawn to win the Ukraine war, and still continues to use it. However, a very important detail that Vladimir Putin overlooked may even cause him to lose this war, and this is now the possibility of an all-out revolt by Russian citizens and soldiers in the Moscow army, who are forcibly deported to the fronts in the Ukrainian war.